Shop Talk with Writers.
I thought this was really a long shot, but of course I wasn't allowing for modern technology that can machine read or even old blotchy typeface on old newspapers. And so 2 days later or so, I got this email from the archivist and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" And attached was this picture of this set of adverts. And for the first time I saw this advert: "I seek a kind person who will educate my intelligent boy, age 14, about my father." I saw it for the first time, and it had an enormous, really out of the blue impact on me, emotional impact, and set me down along this train along this route that led to the book ultimately.
Welcome to Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we are curious about the stories behind the books. I'm Elena Lappin, and my very interesting guest today is eminent Guardian foreign correspondent and writer Julian Borger. Julian has covered many conflicts in different parts of the world, but in his book, I Seek a Kind Person, My Father, 7 Children, and the adverts that helped them escape the Holocaust, he has captured something much closer to home, the story of his own father's hidden fate as a refugee child from Nazi-controlled Vienna. I must add that Julian's beautiful dog, Frobo, was present throughout this interview. Frobo is a displaced and rescued dog himself, but we will never know how much he remembers of his own trauma. He wears it lightly. Here's Julian Borger reading from I Seek a Kind Person. Enjoy.
My name is Julian Borger, and I'm talking today about my book, I Seek a Kind Person. And this passage that I'm going to read is about my father and his father, my grandfather, who had advertised my father in the pages of the classified ads of the Manchester Guardian. And that's how my father and about 80 other Jewish kids from Vienna got to Britain. This passage is about my father Robert and my grandfather Leo and their first arrival in Britain, and how they both adapted very differently to being refugees. Robert shared his father's secular outlook on life and social democratic politics, but in most other ways they were unalike. Leo found peace in the routine of a factory job and walks in the hills on weekend. Robert was an academic wunderkind who never found a way of feeling at ease in his own skin. The refugee's curse is to be from two places and none at the same time. Accepting that paradox is often the key to finding contentment, and I don't think my father ever did. His roots in Britain were shallow but tenacious, and he had to strain to grip the earth under his feet. When the time came for Robert to name his children, he followed family tradition by following no tradition at all, looking instead to the prevailing establishment for inspiration. We were given names that by design could only be English and which suggested a certain status in society, a down payment on the rank and income we were expected to achieve in later life. My full name is Julian Matthew Sebastian. Some of the other middle names bestowed on my siblings were Rupert, Makepeace, Augustine, and Josephine. They were a constant source of irritation and ridicule in my youth, but now at least I can look back on them as part of a broader pattern, the continuation of the eager but ultimately abortive efforts of assimilationist Viennese Jews like the Borgers to burrow deep in Austrian society over generations. The posh names were a learned reflex, meant as armour and camouflage in the new host nation. They made an ill-fitting inherited suit fleetingly fashionable in their day, but already fey and pretentious by the time I was in my teens. There were costs to choosing assimilation over identity. I grew up feeling that I didn't entirely belong even in the neighborhood where I spent the first 18 years of my life. Part of me always felt that we were somehow pretending, and that, underlying our needs, drove me abroad at the earliest opportunity. It was as if we had painted layer after layer of tasteful off-white over the top of something garish, more visceral and unsettling, and I was unsure what to do about that other than to leave. "The past is never dead, it's not even past," said Gavin Stevens, the Mississippi lawyer in William Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun. He's talking about a crime, but also about the history of the American South, which seethes relentlessly under the surface of daily life, very much like Europe's past. The fictional Stevens would have known that, having studied at Heidelberg University. Another Mississippi author, Greg Iles, writing nearly half a century later, elaborated on Faulkner's theme. "All of us labour in webs spun long before we were born, webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity," Iles wrote in The Quiet Game. "The quotidian demands of life distract from this resonance of images and events, but some of us feel it always." I felt I was one of those people, like an oversensitivity to light or smell. The sense of an unspoken history would impinge on my daily peace of mind, and sometimes the past would come roaring to the surface of its own accord, churned up by sickness and death.
Julian Borger, thank you so much for this wonderful reading from your book, I Seek a Kind Person, under subtitle, My Father, 7 Children, and the ADVERTS That Helped Them Escape the Holocaust. This book is several books in one, I feel. It's a memoir, it's a family history biography, it's a history book, it's a meditation on themes of being a refugee, being a foreigner, war, peace, and human fate. Have I missed anything? Is there anything? And also, I should say, investigative journalism and a kind of historical investigation, which is extremely thorough in your book. So as I understand it, the book was triggered. Well, what was it? Actually, I shouldn't say what I think. You tell me. What do you think it was triggered by? Because there were 2 Guardian articles that I have read that preceded the book. One was from 2015 and one from 2021. Am I right?
I think those dates are right, yeah.
Yes. And then came the book. And I was wondering, what is the connection between the articles and the book? How did that evolve?
Well, the 2015 article was really a little bit separate. The foster mother, the Welsh woman who had taken my father in as a refugee and been a foster mother to him, she had died sometime before, but was being reburied in Carnarvon, where she was from, alongside her husband, who'd preceded her in death by some decades himself. And when we went up there for this ceremony, and I heard more about this foster mother that really saved my father's life and made all our lives possible, I just wrote a piece just pondering that, about the impact that she had had on our lives, and the impact that kindness has, that taking in refugees has. And it was a time when there was this, the beginning of this great anti-refugee sentiment sweeping across the land. So it was a meditation on that. The second article that you referred to is very different in that the trigger for this book had happened by then, and the trigger was the discovery in the Guardian archives by the Guardian archivist Richard Nelson of this advert, which was an advert that my grandparents, in particular my grandfather, had placed, looking for the foster parents, looking for a family that would foster my dad in 1938, when after the Nazis had taken over Vienna, and they were really looking to save my dad's life by getting him out of there. And it was Nance Bingley, this woman that we went to honour in 2015, that had taken him in.
Isn't that something that you asked the archivist to do?
Well, yes, and that in itself came as a result of a chance encounter. I've been talking to a immigration lawyer in the US because in my journalistic work I was covering the Trump administration, the first Trump administration this is, and I was talking to this immigration lawyer who was trying to defend refugee seekers from Cameroon who were all just being shoved on planes and flown back to a very uncertain future, to a very uncertain and unsafe environment. And I was exchanging emails with this lawyer who's called Ruth Hargrove, and she, out of the blue, said, just reflected on how people hand on trauma across the generations, and began to talk about her father, who was from Vienna, and whose escape from Vienna had been through an article in the Manchester Guardian. And that really rang a bell for me, because it had been part of a sort of family law that somehow the Manchester Guardian had played a role in my father getting out. And to my shame, I had never really looked it up or tried to follow it up. I didn't know how to follow it up. The source of that story had been somewhat dubious, as someone in our family prone to embellishing stories. So that is my excuse for not looking it up. But the fact that this was another case in which the Manchester Guardian had played a role kind of rang a bell with me. And the Guardian was coming up to his 200th birthday in 2021. So I suggested it. Well, maybe there is something here, and we could do something about the role of the Manchester Guardian in the Second World War and when it came to refugees. And I thought this was really a long shot. But of course, I wasn't allowing for modern technology that can machine read or even old blotchy typeface on old newspapers. And so 2 days later or so, I got this email from the archivist and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" And attached was this picture of this set of adverts. And for the first time I saw this advert: "I seek a kind person who will educate my intelligent boy, age 14, about my father." I saw it for the first time, and it had an enormous, really out of the blue impact on me, emotional impact, and set me down along this train along this route that led to the book ultimately.
So this happened after your father's death?
Many decades. My father died in 1983. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was after he took his own life, and it was my job. I was, at that time, 21, 22, and it was my job to ring around friends and family. And my last call I made was to Nance Bingley, his foster mother, who was still alive. And her immediate reaction was, "He's the Nazis' last victim. They finally got to him," which made no sense to me at all. In the note my father left, it was really about his marriage, his professional life, the details of late middle-aged life, really, that disappointed him, and nothing about the past.
And there was also nothing about the past throughout your life. As his son, he never talked about it, right? Or
that's right. And what I found
nothing
to be a common
at all,
experience.
or were there any hints?
What I've found it to be quite a common experience of children of people who have survived the Holocaust, who were refugees, that there was complete blanket of silence. We obviously knew the basic fact that he had come from Vienna, that he'd been fostered. He didn't talk about it. They didn't like to talk about it either, he or his parents, who both survived, and we both knew. But it was something that really wasn't referred to. And even my mum, who'd met him in the late 1950s, knew very little other than those basic facts. So what I found out in the course of doing the research for this book completely changed my whole understanding of who our family was, or that side of the family was. Really, we had been sheltered from the details of it and from the death and the tragedy that the family had lived through.
So these silences that people of that generation with that sort of traumatic past have lived with and through, a very common theme in families. My own memoir, which was not a Holocaust-related story at all, but it was a memoir about what happens when there is a complete and utter secrecy about certain things in a family, and how ridiculous that actually is, because ultimately that which is kept secret is not a big deal. You can talk about anything. In your case, what I find simply brilliant about this book is that on one hand, you are, of course, interested in exploring your own history, your family history, your personal history, your father's history, but you actually go and try to discover the stories of many other people who've been through similar experiences, people in that same ad who are mentioned in that same ad. I seek a kind person. That was your grandfather's wording, but there were others. There were 5 or 6 others in that same ad, and you go and you try and find them, and others related to the same experience. So, for example, there's a psychologist, George Mandler, whose ad in the paper was placed several months before your grandfather placed his for your father. And you then go and explore all these stories, and you create, so you not only tell your personal story or your family story or history, you actually create a whole epic story really of that era. And you also brilliantly use everyone's partial take on this history, that section of history or that development, and you piece it together like a puzzle. So, for example, I was really, really deeply moved and impressed by how you take George Mandler's experiences and connect them with what your father may have experienced, because they grew up not far from each other in Vienna. They were not that far removed in age. George Mandler was older than your father. Your father was 11 when the ad was placed, and he came to Britain. But you were able to use other people's experiences to imagine, not reimagine because you didn't know anything, but to actually imagine what it may have been like. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, you divide it exactly. It is that division between the journalist impulse to find what happened to all these kids, but it was the other way around in a way. The journalist impulse to tell the stories of these kids is what came first, because it just seemed obvious to me as a journalist. You have 80 children who were advertised over this period, 1938 to 1939. They cried out to find out what happened to them, because in all those little ads, there is the question: did these kids survive? What happened to them? Did the people who placed the advert, their parents, did they survive? And it was it just seemed absolutely obvious to me that I had to, having been presented with this set of facts, had to find out what happened to the 80. And then it was really the price of doing that was I had to turn sort of inwards and tell my family history, which I started off feeling very awkward, speaking in the first person singular, talking about my own family, talking about a very painful, the most painful, obviously, moment in my family's history, when my father took his life in 1983, and to drill down on that moment was, on the outset, extremely painful. And I saw it as if you're going to tell the story of these 80 kids, and in particular these half dozen other of kids who I focus on, then the price for telling that is you have to find out everything that I could about my father.
So do I understand you correctly? Your first impulse was not to talk about yourself and your own story and to understand what actually happened to you and your family and your father, but actually to tell the stories of them all, and yours would have been a minor element of that.
I realized it would seem like I would be trying to hide it if I made it a minor element, but on the outset it seemed the less exciting story. He'd come to Britain. He had become very good academic and become a lecturer, and until at one point in 1983 he takes his life. It turned out that the story was far more complex, tragic, and that there was far more to find out than I could ever have imagined. So in the end, I was incredibly grateful that it had sort of pulled me along in this direction, because otherwise there'd be all sorts of things about my own family I would never have known. But yes, very much the impulse was to tell the story of the 80 kids, in particular the 6 or 7 kids who had left really full accounts, because the underlying piece of luck in the book is that these 6 or 7 accounts, which are pretty much complete from childhood through the Anschluss, through the war, through getting out to Britain, ever happened to them next, they were all very different stories, and they told the story of survival in different ways. So of survival in very different shades, and the narratives were so very different that they sort of cried out as stories to be told.
I find that people who grow up with that kind of secrecy grow up with it. It is part of their lives since, their earliest childhoods. They then often grow up to be very investigative in their work. They become hungry for finding out all the stories they can, everything about everyone else, but keeping themselves out of it. So, for example, when I was writing my memoir, my editor, Lenny Goodings at Virago, kept saying, "But where are you in this story? I need to know about you. This is your memoir." And I kept saying, "No, Lenny, it's not about me. It's about all these people. It's the story of a whole century of human stories. It's not about me." And I really resisted that. I felt that it wasn't about me. So I was very impressed that you actually finally found, at the very end, show your heart in the book, and I suppose any psychologist would say your father committed suicide. This book is an attempt to understand that, and to understand the father you actually didn't really know, or the reasons behind that decision, and the hurt and the anger and all of that. That's all very kind of easily traced to common psychology. But you didn't do it that way. You imagined the whole world that your father was a part of, that you didn't have the tools to know or to understand. But now, as an adult man, you did. And you did that in your own both professional and emotional and kind of scholarly way. You made sure that you had all the facts right. You spoke to so many people about their experiences, and you were clearly very moved by what they went through. And in those conversations, I was wondering, did they ask you questions back? Did they ask you things that you opened up about to them, but maybe not to anyone else in your life?
To some extent, yes, because, for example, when I was talking to George Mandler's son, Peter, who I understand that you know separately from a different route, who was a historian and so very curious, and we realized, of course, that we had so many things in common. And so I ended up having conversations with him about that experience of growing up the son of a Viennese Jew, which I realized were unique to certain foods that we ate, what we ate on picnics. There was sort of family law that we had in common. So there was a sort of sense of, oh yeah, this part of my life was because of who I am and where I came from, and because of this family history. It was distinctive flavor of this particular family history.
I was actually thinking about people who survived, who would have been your father's generation. So, for example, you speak about a phone call or a Zoom call you had with a woman called Liz, who was still alive when you reached her, and she was able to actually tell you. She was like a time machine in a way. She was able to really tell you what it was like and what she experienced. And so someone like that, did they ask you anything about how you felt?
That was really one of the most wonderful experiences of doing the book, because I'd really given up on the idea of finding anyone still alive. My first few times going through all the names, because it took a few sweeps through to find everyone. Not everyone was easy to find. And Lisbeth Weiss, who became Liz Ruderman, living in Connecticut, was I found very late on, and I was so delighted there was someone still alive. And when we set up this Zoom call and she appeared on the screen, I was just over it. It was just a feeling of joy to have this sense of a human link back to my father's childhood, that this person had walked the same streets, had lived through many of the same things, and here I was talking to her. I think she did ask me a couple of things, but we were so focused on her. But nevertheless, that sense of connection, the sense of there being a survivor, and I found this survivor, was really just a joyful experience. I listened to the tape of this interview, and I keep on laughing out loud because I'm so happy to have found her.
How do you explain, or how do you understand the reasons for the secrecy that your father preserved forever?
I think it's quite common, and one of the impulses, I don't know in his case what his thinking was, what his motivation is, but it is common, and one of the common motives for it is the feeling that we must not burden another generation with the horrible things that we witness. And in later life, in my journalist life, I went at one point to cover the making of a film in Cambodia about the year zero, the era of the Khmer Rouge. And all the extras on the movie were adults, but had grown up in this horrible episode in history. And until that time, that they had been hired as extras to be on the movie, they hadn't talked about it with their children at all. So it is not just about the Holocaust. It is something about human nature, this feeling of, it is so horrible, it is so terrible, it's such a burden that it stops with me and I will not transfer it. But of course, there are so many other ways for trauma to be transferred other than in the recollections of terrible things that happened in history.
So actually not talking about it is the worst thing they could have done for the next generation, because they, in your case, your father actually deprived you of the means to understand his life from his childhood. And he probably didn't think it was necessary, that you could just be together, father and son, but you didn't need to know what it was like for him to get there. A little bit like this dog who is sitting here with us on the couch. We are recording this in your mother's house. And there's a wonderful dog called Frodo, who you adopted in America, brought him to England. Is he a refugee? Is he an emigre? I don't know.
Yeah, he's West Virginian diaspora, I think.
Yes, yeah. And you don't know anything about his past, his early past. And yet, here he is. He's perfectly happy because this situation is ideal for him. Doesn't work that way with humans. we need to know, I think, where we come from, who we are. Interesting kind of counterfact is probably the biggest investigation I've ever done was on Benjamin Wilkomirski, that book Fragments, where he wrote a false Holocaust memoir claiming that he was a child in 2 concentration camps, not 1. And the investigation was to find out, is it true? Is it not true? What I was mostly interested in, this appeared in Granta in 2000. Why? Who is this person who would do that? And the thing that he did in a way that he tried to pretend to be like a survivor, but the thing that he didn't get right, utterly wrong, was that he talked about it. He wrote a kind of Holocaust porn in his book. Survivors do not do that ever. They don't talk about it. And if they do, they're very cautious. They actually try not to talk about it. They try to keep the horrors to themselves. And this man was pouring it all out, trying to get sympathy based on that. And that should have given him away much earlier than it did, but publishers loved it and so on. And in fact, that man had a completely different trauma of his own, which he should have written about. That would have been much more interesting. He wasn't even Jewish. He was a descendant of the Swiss, Verdinkinder, who were like slave children sold into kind of ownership. And he was there's like a separate caste of people in Switzerland from the Middle Ages, and it still existed into the 50s. So he came from that. He lost his mother at the age of 4 and was adopted by a wealthy Zurich older couple. And he was trying to erase the memory of who he actually was and invented a whole different identity, the ultimate sort of victim identity. And that is the exact opposite of what someone who writes a book like yours does. You are truly, every detail is examined a million times over. And I love how you try to get to know people you didn't know or you couldn't have known, but you get their stories through memoirs, through conversations, through maybe other books that family members may have written. And I was wondering, how does your journalism help you with this kind of writing?
The obvious, I think that conviction that it's possible to find anyone, from experience of journalism, made me feel, that this is doable. That we can, if you find there are enough sources, people leave their traces in all sorts of unexpected places, in local newspapers, in the Midwest or something. The technical capabilities of the search engines now, at the extent that so much of this is doable, that it would be possible to track down each one of them. So one of the things was that gave me the confidence I'd be able to get there. And secondly, this is a particular kind of journalism which I really enjoyed. I've only done it a couple of times in my professional life, which is digging deep in the archives. And I really enjoyed it. And that feeling of history being locked away there, and you can if you can read the clues the right way, you can unlock the secrets left behind. And that's how it felt in writing this book. It's not a kind of journalism that I've done much of working for The Guardian, but I got really into it doing it for this book and spending weeks in the Vienna archives and months online searching and cross-referencing and tracking, and really enjoyed it.
As I said before, we are recording this interview in your mother's house, and you told me that this is the area where you grew up. And then you mentioned in your reading that this is where you left. This is the place you left when you felt the urge to go away. Tell me a little bit more about that. How strange did it feel for you to grow up here, and where did you go when you left?
I think the reason why, we're talking about West London, we're talking about Chiswick, we're talking about the most pleasant, leafy, place, manageable on earth in terms of a comfortable place. But it being a comfortable place just didn't feel completely right. And I think to some extent my brothers had this feeling somehow that we weren't who we were maybe pretending to be, in that my father put on a great show of sort of almost having been English back into the Middle Ages, and gave us, rather posh names, and put a front of being rather, successful and a man of substance, in which at the time when he really wasn't. His professional life, academic life didn't go as he had imagined it would. And so in a way, the deeper the disappointment, the more of a show he put on. And so I had this strong feeling that we were somehow, pretending and didn't really belong there. And maybe also the sort of comfortableness of it didn't sit well with me. And so I grew up very much looking for adventure, and after university I went out to Africa to work as for an economic institute. And then when I was in Africa, that's when I changed over to being a journalist, and really spent much of my life, my adult life, on the road. And now in the writing of this book, the first time I really thought about it, I was definitely running away from something, and that's how I would identify what I was running away from.
So, feeling that you don't quite belong in this kind of life here, that this isn't the life you were meant to lead, or that you were necessarily born into, maybe the way some of your friends were as a teenager, that must have been a reflection of two things. One, your father must have felt the same and he covered it up. And the other thing may have been something like feeling how your father felt without him telling you explicitly. Is that possible?
I think one thing that sticks in my mind is that when he would go and see my grandparents up in Shropshire, where they had settled, we would go up there reasonably often, and we would arrive, and they lived in a little bungalow in Shrewsbury, and he would arrive and start speaking German to them, and he seemed relaxed in a way, even though kind of they constantly irritated him. He seemed relaxed and at home in a way that he just didn't seem at home in London. And I remember feeling, even as a young child, that he's somehow different, that this is where he really feels he belongs, and where he's truly relaxed. So that struck me intuitively, even when I was young.
That's so interesting. You saw two sides of him growing up. And based on the book, I don't know, but based on how you described growing up with your father and how he was as a father to you, he seemed colder at home than in these other situations. Is that right?
Yes, because you see him with his parents, which is a side of him that he'd really put to one side, because it turns out he grew up being called Bobby, which was a real shock to us, and we found out later, because it would have been so cheeky to have called him Bobby where he was Robert, and this this lecturer at university, and yet they were really the only two people left alive who knew who he really was, apart from his foster mother Nance, who also had seen him when he was vulnerable, when he was a little boy refugee, and all of them could, I imagine, still see Bobby, the child, within the man.
So, as an adult man, by writing this book, you found the boy refugee in your father, and were you then able to see that boy refugee more in how he became in later life?
Yes, absolutely. I think I came to see the boy hidden inside the man in a way that was obscured from me before, and just one of the thing that really drove it home to me was we'd grown up thinking, well, our family managed by some fluke to escape, and everyone survived. That wasn't true at all. Lots of people in our family, close family, who had been killed in the Holocaust, but they just weren't talked about. They were erased from our family history, which is, if you think about it, when I came to think about it, an amazing and terrible thing. My grandmother's sister and father, but most importantly, my father's cousin, who he'd really grown up as an elder brother. My father was an only child, and this cousin, Mordecai, or Motti, was obviously extremely close to him because all the photos showed them together as thick as thieves, playing together on bikes together. And what happened to Motti was he ended up working as in a section of the French resistance, German-speaking section called the Travail Allemand, which were sent undercover back into the Reich to gather intelligence, to foment unrest, and if necessary to trigger uprisings. And he was sent to a steelworks in Linz, the Hermann Goering Steelworks, and because of a complete screw-up inside his network, the members of his network, which were still in France, who were arrested in Paris, and because they completely messed up, and when it came to security and confidentiality, they discovered Motti working under a false name in Linz. He was arrested by Gestapo and died under torture in Vienna in Gestapo headquarters, and we knew nothing about Motti. We kind of vaguely knew he had a cousin who died. We knew none of the details. None of the fact that he had a cousin who was like a brother who had died, a hero of the resistance under torture, and yet his pictures weren't on our wall. He wasn't talked about. He wasn't remembered, and that just seemed extraordinary to me. And also thought, what a strain on my father to keep all that buried.
You sort of pick up that task. You mentioned walking around the cemetery in Vienna, where on the stones, and the family stones, it says unforgotten, but they have been forgotten. And you say, well, not by us, not anymore. So you are kind of resuming the memory of what had been forgotten. And that's another thing that your book has clearly accomplished and will have accomplished for your children and for many others. And as a father, did examining this history made you think or rethink anything that you do as a father with your children yourself?
Yes, I think my guiding principle was don't be like my dad in so many ways. So my dad, like many refugee dads, but huge amount of pressure on performing academically. Huge amount of pressure. I try not to do that. I try to be, as honest about, what our family is and the things that happen in the family, and very consciously thinking, don't be like your dad. Lay it out there. And so, it has given me in a sort of reverse way a blueprint for how to be a dad.
At the very end of your book, having done all this research, the investigations, the analysis, the historical deep dive into every single story and history, you suddenly come back to yourself, and then you just talk about yourself at the end. It's incredibly moving and very powerful, and it feels, you know, in every great film and a great novel, the hero changes, and that feels like that sort of change has happened to the author of this book. Does that feel right? Is that something that's happened? Has the book changed you in any way or affected you?
Yeah, in that, okay, now I have a much better understanding of who my family, or that family, side of the family was. And I suppose it feels different to be descended not just from people who managed to escape, but also from people who fought back and resisted. There was another lineage, there was another legacy there that I was unaware of. You can never understand. You never understand why someone takes a decision to take their own life. But it allowed me to see him and his whole life and his childhood, and begin to glimpse the child hidden within the man. And that was transformative, in that if you would ask me, you know, did I have did I hold it against my father that he'd made that decision, I would have denied it and said, well, you know, it was his decision. Mm-hmm. But I think in the process of writing this book, I came to the realization, yes, I actually had resented him for doing what he did. But at the same time, come to that realization, also came an understanding of who he was and the kind of pressures that he had to deal with. And also it made me realize that Nance, his foster mother, in that conversation I'd had with her after my father's death, was revealed something that she had knowledge about my father that I didn't. That she could see the young boy. She could see Bobby Borger in a way that was, he was completely invisible to me. But what I also found, really at the end of doing the work for this book, is that the last place my father had gone after he'd left our family home and before he took his own life, was to go and try and find her, to try and find Nance, who was his only link by then, because his parents had died by then, his only link with the past, the only person left really on earth who knew him as Bobby Borger. And when I'd called her and told her that he was dead, it must have been awful for her, because she had been away. When he'd gone to try and find her, she had been out of town. She'd gone back to Wales. And so she must have felt, if only if I'd been there, I could have saved him. And it must have struck her that of all the people he'd got to know in all his life, in London, in Manchester, all around Britain, he had tried to seek her out. Must, I think, have convinced her that it was really about the past. It was really about the person he had been when he first arrived in Britain at the age of 11.
On a slightly lighter note, you inherited a cardboard box from your grandfather full of amazing stuff, and that included some records. Your grandfather had a music radio shop in Vienna, and possibly some of these items were sold there, I don't know, but there were some very interesting records. Do you still have those?
Actually, I don't know where the records are. They got...
Did you digitally maybe record
No,
them?
I didn't.
Oh my!
But in this house we're in this flat where we are, it has a cellar, and a lot of my things inherited, including the lederhosen that we were made to wear as children, was stored when I was younger, and then I travelled, and then the cellar in this flat flooded, and so a lot of the past that from that era was lost in these floods. And I'm pretty sure that those old 78s that my grandfather had perish with them, unfortunately. But I still have this other box of things, of these objects.
Yes.
Like old medals of the passports that my grandparents had come out with, stamped with the red J for Juden and with the swastika on. These are all mementos of the past that I'd sort of carried around with me for decades, not really understanding what they stood for.
Too bad, because we could have used those 78s for the soundtrack of this podcast, but we'll find something similar, don't worry. And on an even lighter note, you mentioned in the book that your favorite movie is The Third Man. Can you tell me why?
Okay, first of all, it is the best movie ever made, in just the way it's shot, the plot, the sense of mystery over Harry Lime, and the use of light and shadow in post-war Vienna. So it's my favorite film, but also with my favorite ending of any film, which in the last shot, we see the heroine, Anna, walk down this avenue with trees on either side, and waiting for her nearer the camera is the main hero, Holly. And you think at the end they're going to be reconciled and it's going to be a happy ending. But she walks right past him and past the camera and out of shot. And their future is left undecided. And I think it's just such a great ending of a movie. Apparently, Graham Greene wanted a happy ending. Carol Reed was insistent that it should be like that, and I think he was right. But what I found out in doing the research for the book is that path that she's walking along is through the Vienna's Central Cemetery, and going sort of bisecting the Jewish section of the cemetery, and my ancestors were buried on either side of that path, which seemed to me so extraordinary that I would be drawn to this movie and to this scene in particular, and yet to have such an unknown but deep historical connection to that very geography, it just stunned me.
It's incredibly mysterious what we don't know, but know somehow. Julian Borger, thank you so much for being on Shop Talk with Writers.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Frodo.
Yeah.
Frodo was
not too much ball licking.
He was absolutely no. He was. This was Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest today was journalist Julian Borger. His book, I Seek a Kind Person, My Father, 7 Children, and the Adverts That Helped Them Escape the Holocaust, is published by John Murray. I'm Elena Lappin. Thank you for listening. ShelterBox Book Club is no ordinary book club. Its 3,500 members across the UK help provide support for communities in crisis across the world. Catherine Thornhill told us more about ShelterBox and how it connects readers with areas of conflict via their shared love of storytelling.
So ShelterBox is an international disaster relief charity, and we provide emergency shelter and household items to families around the world who've lost their homes to disasters. And alongside the many ways that people can fundraise for that work, we have a book club, which is why we're interested in talking to people who are interested in writers and writing. So we have a book subscription service called the ShelterBox Book Club, which people can join for £10 a month, and they get a book in the post every 6 weeks. And those books are from the countries around the world that we're working in. So it's a really great way of reading globally and supporting the people that you're sort of reading about, or at least people from the same cultures and communities. So we were kind of mulling ways that we could connect people, because that's what charity is. It's basically just a bridge between people who want to help people and people who need help. And what better way to connect people than through books and stories? And it's sort of like allowing people to really walk in the shoes of another person. I mean, all books do that. But particularly like reading global stories, and often we'll be reading books from people who have experiences as refugees or with displacement themselves. And it really helps to take disasters as they are in the news away from statistics and down to the like actual individuals.
So you have a book club. How does the book club work? How does it operate?
So we've got 3,000 members across the UK. It's a suggested donation, so they get to choose between like £10 and £15 a month. And then they get a book in the post every 6 weeks for that. And the way that the book club actually works is that we put forward a vote of 3 books on a theme. So we've just voted on our next book. So we put forward 3 books on the theme of new beginnings, because it's going to be our New Year read. And then everyone gets to vote. And then whichever book wins the vote is the one that we then get printed by the publisher and pack up and send out to everyone. And with that book that they physically receive through the post, they also get a letter which connects that book to somebody that they are supporting through their donations. And then they have 6 weeks to read it. And then at the end of that, we do a series of events. So kind of standard book club. We have like a Zoom call with as many members as want to join and come and discuss. We do social media debates. So we've got a private Facebook group and people can put all of their thoughts on that. And then my favourite bit is we get the authors to join us for a live Q&A. So that's really special because mostly they're based outside of the UK and often they haven't had a chance to come to the UK for like a press tour or like book tour. And so this is often like the first time they've had a chance to have an interaction with readers in the UK, and our members get to have like an actual conversation with them, which is so special. Amazing authors like Shivangi Swarup, we spoke to earlier in the year, who's an Indian author who's just got the most poetic and magical mind. We just spoke to a Latin American author called Carlos Fonseca about his book Austral, and before that North American and Indian poet / novelist called Amit Majmudar, who's amazing. Lots and lots of people. So we go from people you've probably never heard of who aren't on the like front page of the like the bookseller and on the big tables at Waterstones to some like big names.
Find out more about ShelterBox Book Club on their website shelterbox.org. Shop Talk with Writers is delighted to help spread the word about this fantastic organization.